How does a writer talk about the past in a story? There are a couple different ways I could think of, but each one had clear negative trade-offs. One of the most common solutions for this problem is flashbacks. And because of this popularity and misuse, they've become incredibly cliche. And while it's hard to completely avoid flashbacks, what if there was a show that came along and made them a central part of the entire story? Oh, and it was really good. This is Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about the anatomy of a flashback. So let's start first with those 4 ways to talk about the past in media. Even if a writer wants to write a completely chronological story, there's still a need to inform the audience of the past, which brings in those 4 tools we were just talking about. I think Avatar: The Last Airbender is a great example of all 4 of these methods. Now, starting first with Avatar's most famous form of exposition, you can probably guess it: the intro.
But that all changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
It perfectly sets up the show and all the major points of information from Avatar's history that needs to be talked about. However, it's a monologue, and kind of a long one at that. When exposition isn't done well, it runs the risk of being boring, heavy-handed, and disruptive. But there are other ways to talk about the past in a story, the second being presenting information. Now, this one's more based in the world building or context of a scene rather than the things being said. If we look just at Avatar's pilot, a more overt example of this is the way the Southern Water Tribe reacts to anything related to the Fire Nation. A less overt example would be the fact that Zuko's ship isn't equipped with winter equipment. These aren't direct forms of exposition, just information that gives us insight into the history of the world. Now, this category of information I think heavily overlaps with the next category, which is inference. Based off of anything you learn from exposition, flashbacks, or especially information, you can take all these moving puzzle pieces and place them together and infer new things. Take for example Zuko's scar, his relationship with his uncle, and his overwhelming desire to catch the Avatar. They're all puzzle pieces that infer a bigger history. I'd put inference at the top of my personal favorite ways of exploring the past in stories, because other methods, especially when done poorly, have a very heavy-handed approach. Not to mention the fact that they're often incredibly disruptive, which leads perfectly into flashbacks. I think in order to avoid long-winded exposition and the inclination to show not tell, flashbacks have become predominantly the most popular way of talking about the past in stories. But inherent to a flashback is stepping away from the story you're interested in to get information from a predetermined scene from the past. Like exposition, it tends to disrupt the story. Now, that's not even factoring in that flashbacks are used a lot, especially in bad ways. Flashbacks have become a cliche. They're almost in every piece of media you consume. Take a second and try to think of a famous story without a flashback. They're also very often done poorly, whether or not it's to cover for bad writing or because they don't properly understand how to make a flashback worth it. There's this thing that happens a lot in media, where writers won't properly set up a situation, and then they'll either turn to a deus ex machina or a flashback that is immediately paid off. Setting up something to immediately be resolved very rarely is satisfying, especially when flashbacks are invasive. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have a flashback be immediately relevant. It just means using them as a replacement for proper setup is a cop-out. Because if they're not done well, the trade-offs and cliché just end up being very frustrating. So what differentiates a good and bad flashback? Let's start first with an example. The 7th episode of Frieren Beyond Journey's End has a remarkable little opening and closing of an idea in about 8 minutes and 30 seconds. And it's all built around flashbacks. Episode 7 starts with Frieren walking alongside her party in this beautifully animated, subtle little scene. Part of what makes this such a cool example is it's not just a flashback, it also uses information, exposition, and inference. The scene is built around this fake tome from the founder of modern human magic, the great mage Flamma. With only fake tomes circulating in the world, Hyder likens Flamma to legend, questioning whether or not she even existed. Frieren makes an offhanded comment wondering whether or not she's the only person who actually remembers Flamma's face, which Himmel catches. Initially, there's no definitive reason for this flashback, but we're given information, exposition, and things to infer. But that's not the only reason this flashback was done very well. A part of flashbacks in literature is the ability to make them an action, an experience of a character. So the following scene is Frieren literally waking up from a dream that was that flashback. This works heavily in line with the way that Frieren experiences flashback throughout the rest of the series, because the whole point is that her new adventure runs parallel to her old one, and she gets to recontextualize her understanding of her previous experiences. This runs in conjunction beautifully with her character growth. So a couple minutes later in episode 7, Frieren ends up in a city celebrating the heroes that saved the world, her old party. And much like multiple moments where Frieren has run into statues of Himmel, there's a monument to the party in the center of the town, where wreaths of flowers are hung on their heads. Now there's so many freaking layers to this, let's just take a second. The wreaths are a callback to when Himmel placed a wreath of flowers on Frieren's head and when she did it in return at the end of episode 2. The statues are always practical to the story at hand, but we never fully understand the context behind them. An interesting character trait up to this point in the story is that Frieren goes out of her way to avoid any celebration of her previous party. She runs in contrast to Himmel, purposely avoiding bringing up her name and the fanfare that comes with it, avoiding the fame that's paired with her history. But the significance in this festival comes primarily in the second flashback. Frieren has a recontextualized understanding of why Himmel went out of his way to create all of these statues. The flashback itself is actually very well paced with good music and comedic beats, but it all leads to this moment where he advocates that the number one reason he creates all these statues is because he doesn't want Frieren to be alone in the future. This all ties into the fact that the great mage Flamme is now a legend and he wants to be remembered, not just by the people around him, but more specifically Frieren, which then the episode cuts to a close-up of his statue. It ties in beautifully into the overarching theme of Frieren's journey and character growth, but also showcases that flashbacks can be so much more than a cliche. This is just one small example. Good flashbacks are actually constant throughout the story. They're paired with, set up by, and lead to highly resonant emotional moments, because ultimately they're worth it. What differentiates a good and bad flashback? Whether or not it's worth it. And while the equation's pretty simple, does it offer more than it takes away, the execution is actually very tricky. You have to work around pacing, audience engagement, given the fact that it's a predetermined circumstance. You have to make people care about characters that are already gone and a story that's already determined. A flashback needs to be fast enough to keep audiences engaged, but it also needs to be substantial enough to warrant having gone there in the first place. That's a hard balance. It's worth factoring in that flashbacks have been historically used to cover plot holes. So while flashbacks are often used to support setup, they can't be the setup themselves, unless the setup itself is setup. So while flashbacks seem like a simple tool, to use them well is actually very complex, which is especially true when it comes to Frieren, because flashbacks are a staple of the story. Frieren's character arc is built around the juxtaposition of her old adventure with her new one. As these flashbacks are active things happening to Frieren, it helps us understand the character better, but also offers her lessons that she gets to immediately apply to her new experiences. It's an incredibly cool way to explore this everlasting elf archetype, and it helps you and Frieren learn to love the characters that surround her previous and new party members. This show does a remarkable job both subverting and embracing trope. It's jam-packed with montages and flashbacks, both of which are irreplaceable. It takes place primarily in a generic fantasy world, and yet somehow offers more in world building than most other shows I've seen. It convinced me to change my mind in the way I think about fantasy. And a fundamental part of why it's such a great show is represented beautifully in its remarkable flashbacks. Taking a tool that is tired and saturated and using it to evoke such remarkably strong emotion. Thanks for watching. This was the 11th video in my series called Exploring Frieren. If you enjoyed it, consider going and watching some of my other episodes or subscribing. I'll be back next week with another video. And to all the people who are returning, thank you for supporting the series. I'm excited to keep making it.